Hello friends, today's video is about weed, marijuana, cannabis, whatever you want to call it, the risks and the pleasures of weed. And I was a 21-year daily user of weed, so I have quite some experience. And with my journey with weed, I've done quite a bit of research and seen both sides from its proponents and the people against weed. I have done my research as well, but I wanted to begin with my personal journey with it. I remember being very curious about drugs, alcohol, and tobacco from a young age. I loved the smell of my uncle's cigarettes that he lit after taking me for a ride on his motorcycle. I would suck on my candy cigarette as I happily breathed in the fragrant smoke of his real one. When the grown-ups had parties, I would always sneak myself some wine out of the bottle. My father took us to weekly trips to the library and Barnes & Noble bookstore where I would sit on the floor and read books about Amsterdam and how people legally smoked in coffee shops and paid for prostitutes in the red light district. And I would fantasize about going there. My cousins smoked a lot of pot and were successful businessmen and lawyers with nice homes, beautiful wives and girlfriends, and gave their time and energy fighting for the effort to legalize marijuana. And went to large events like Burning Man. It all seemed very glamorous, and I looked up to them and tried to repeat everything they did. They would always give me a couple beers, but did not give me marijuana until I was of age, like 18, 19, in college already. And I was very grateful that they did. As I got into high school and started struggling at school and my social life, fantasizing about drug use turned into actively seeking it out. Every time I would fight with my parents or was disappointed with my results at school and sports, I would take a beer from my parents' liquor cabinet, lock myself in the bathroom, and chug it. All it took was one beer to lift my burden away, and I could finally just breathe. I struggled in school, doing extremely well in history and English, but struggling to get C's and low B's in math and science, in spite of spending most of my time studying for those subjects, often all night. I also utterly failed in sports, in spite of giving everything I had to trying to be decent. I was so scared to talk to women, and even after getting a date to the prom, I was afraid to talk to her in between or sit next to her on the school bus. I was also trying to learn piano, hearing my mother's voice saying, "It is my dream that my children will play these songs for their family during parties and holidays." I was no good at piano, and I hated doing it, actually. I was a nervous wreck, basically, during my sophomore year of high school, and that's when I said, fuck it. I was still planning on going to college and getting a good job, but with all the extracurriculars and things that kept me out of trouble, I was like, a big fuck it and fuck you. I'm fucking done with this fucking bullshit. So I had a bunch of activities that were keeping me out of all that, but when I was 16 and a sophomore, I really said a big fuck it. And that's when I met a kid named Jamal. Me and Jamal met in interesting circumstances. Jamal was originally my enemy and did not like me, and I didn't like him, and we would talk shit to each other. He was fat, so I would call him fat and telling everyone that he had big tits, and I'd give him titty twisters. And he would make fun of me for being skinny and Indian, making jokes about me selling Slurpees at 7-Eleven and shitting on the road. We actually thought each other's jokes were hilarious, and it was difficult to hate each other. So we basically became blood brothers and spent every day together. Jamal was also the kid that provided my high school with weed, tobacco, booze, and bootleg porn DVDs. At the beginning, I wanted to start my smoking with just cigarettes, so Jamal took me underneath the bleachers on the football field and gave me my first Marlboro 27, a sweet, almost chocolate-flavored cigarette. Tobacco was not an acquired taste for me. I was completely hooked after that first cigarette, and for a week, I started smoking during lunch break underneath the bleachers, along with dipping tobacco in class and smoking cigars on the walk home from school. The illicitness and secrecy of underage tobacco use at school also became an addiction. The whole ritual of hiding it from the adults was also addictive. I felt smart and like I could get away with something. I was more afraid to try the weed than I was cigarettes since it was illegal, all the bad things my parents told me it was laced with. And honestly, I have a little bit of OCD and I'm a hygiene person. I didn't know who was handling it. And the smell was honestly repulsive to me in the beginning. So I didn't think it smelled great and I was afraid to use it because I never really crossed the line into doing illegal things. But I remember after a particularly hard day, sitting in Jamal's 1980s Cadillac Eldorado and listening to the 50 Cent's new album and just saying another big fuck it while he was smoking a bowl of weed. And I told him to give me a fucking hit. He happily obliged and told me it was different than cigarettes and I needed to hold the smoke in my lungs as long as I could to get the most effect. I did it enthusiastically in the way he taught me, and my life seriously changed since that moment. I remember all of my confusion, pain, worry, and insecurity leaving my body and a warm feeling of fuck it, who gives a fuck, coming over me. It did feel a lot more powerful than alcohol because I still had a sense of control over myself. The effects of the nicotine from the cigarettes were a lot more powerful after smoking dope. So we would always conclude our weed smoking sessions with a cigarette, and it felt amazing while sucking on the Marlboro. All the troubles melted away and could wait till later. My use of weed and other drugs only increased with time. And since Jamal, all of my best friends were people who sold pot and other drugs. I also started selling some pot to friends to finance my growing habit and ensure that I had enough to get me through the day. I tried almost every drug and frequently binge drank alcohol, but always viewed weed as harmless and even beneficial for my health. And my usage exponentially increased each year, and all the people I surrounded myself with all smoked weed. Being diagnosed with cancer at 18 made me give up tobacco, but only increased my weed use and gave me even more of an excuse to use it. Maybe some of you have similar stories on how you got started. But I wanted to give you that story because it does creep up on you. Addiction creeps up on you. And you think it's not a big deal just to get started with simple things like a cigarette or weed or whatever. But the young mind is very impressionable. And I don't agree with everything the government does and regulates, but there's a reason young people should stay away from these things until they can make an informed choice, because addiction is much stronger when you start younger. And I just wanted to give you my story about that, because if you have kids going through this, or if you're going through it yourself, it's not as harmless as you think, and it could change your life, and it definitely changed mine. You might get bronchitis or a cough after a while of being a habitual weed smoker, but that's it. I always have been very active, running, hiking, lifting, yoga, and smoking weed had been an absolute performance enhancer, enabling me to go harder and longer with less pain. For already active and motivated people, weed can be a wonder drug, easing your physical and emotional pain and allowing you to carry out the workouts with less pain and exhaustion. Unlike drinking alcohol, weed does not put strain on your liver and dehydrate you, and no matter how much of it you use, it's not going to give you a hangover. Many scientific studies have proven weed can reduce inflammation in the body and possibly even fight cancer cells. Except the damage it could possibly do to the lungs when smoked, which is not a problem for most people who are active, do cardio, and keep their lungs strong. Weed is pretty easier in your body compared to most other drugs, but that's also what makes it so addictive and dangerous, because it's hard to know when to stop and when to take a break. My point is that weed can be an absolute wonder drug physically for those who use it to ease their pain and don't sit on the couch all day playing video games and being lazy. There are many people I know who depend on weed to live their lives relatively normally, and I'm pretty sure that they wouldn't be able to move without it. People with arthritis, people I know with serious PTSD and serious physical pain who would not function without it. And there is many uses for it. So I don't want to knock it altogether. What weed does for physical pain, it can temporarily do for emotional pain, making you forget all your regrets, resentments, insecurities, guilt, and anger for a few hours and have some delicious relief. The only problem is that using weed for emotional pain is like putting a much needed vacation on a credit card, paying full interest and making minimum payments. You will absolutely get relief for as long as you are medicating yourself, but whenever you stop, none of your problems are resolved, and your emotional problems will be even further entrenched in your subconscious mind. When the vacation is over and the weed wears off, you're paying interest, and your problems do become bigger because you have not processed them and dealt with them, because the weed enables you to be okay with whatever's going on. In my experience, it is impossible to process and release emotional pain when I'm self-medicating with weed. I have to accept what is happening and feel the pain fully in order for my body and mind to process it and let it go. And smoking weed when I'm going through something hard gets in the way of that. In spite of what everyone's telling you, weed is very addictive and can cause dependence, especially for people that use it to cope with emotional pain. Frequent use of weed will create a tolerance in your system, causing you to need more and more to get the same effect. The feeling of total relief and release that I got when I first smoked a bowl with Jamal was absolutely the best time I had on weed. For the next 21 years, I was chasing that same feeling without fully getting it. Out of the dozens of weed users I met in my life, I met only 2 people that can keep a limit on their use and stick to it and use the concept of microdosing successfully. Microdosing involves using a minuscule amount of weed that you usually don't even catch a buzz with for strictly medical and not recreational purposes. So they use a little bit all the time. They don't get high off of it, and it is for medical reasons, and they're not using it to get high. And very, very few people can stick to that limit. They're an absolute minority among pot users. Weed also has a high financial cost. Money that you could spend on other things like going on a vacation, taking your significant other out on a date night, or a gym membership, you will be spending on weed. I spend a minimum of $200 and oftentimes much more on weed per month, and that really added up over the years. Being dependent on weed is very complicated, and due to its addictive nature, coming off of it can really affect your everyday life. On my many attempts to quit, my appetite was non-existent, my stomach and muscles hurt, and I was also not able to be intimate with my girlfriend, which was pretty frustrating and scary for both of us. Using weed regularly messes up your brain dopamine system, which is a reward chemical in the brain. If you fry your dopamine receptors with weed, it affects all the pleasure centers of your brain, which highly reduces the pleasure and satisfaction you get out of eating, working out, sex, and a lot of other things we take for granted in this life. Unfortunately, these side effects, the lack of appetite, the pain, the lack of motivation, the erectile dysfunction is unavoidable. And it takes many months and a lot of self-inflicted discipline to get out of it, including working out, yoga, stepping out of your comfort zone and taking on new challenges. You need to do hard things, challenge yourself, and work towards your purpose and intentionally put yourself in situations that are uncomfortable. This will rebuild the dopamine in your brain. After a few months of suffering and hard work, it is possible to enjoy life fully without the help of weed. But it is that period of detox, overcoming cravings, and getting it out of your system during which most people fail and relapse. So when you're in that period of detox, doing hard things without weed, trying to live your life and carry on your everyday tasks without weed, and trying to rebuild the dopamine in your brain, that's when most people fail and suffer a relapse. And this happened to me probably over 10 times trying to quit. And mark my words, weed is one of the hardest things to quit. It's very addictive. If you have an addictive personality and you get hooked on it, it is one of the hardest things to quit. Especially since it's not hard to get these days. Another issue with weed is that it makes you docile and accept almost anything. The relief of self-medication made me stay at jobs where I was unhappy and had no chance of promotion and doing better in life. Weed also made me stay in relationships that were toxic and that I was unhappy. And I didn't just have the mental power to change the relationship or get out of it because it just made me accept everything. Many wise people say that the common people accept what the elites, powerful, and people in government do to us because we are so heavily medicated on weed and other drugs to fight back. That's something to think about. That might be a little bit of, conspiracy theory and stuff, but just everyday life, regular weed use has a dampening effect on ambition for many people. And the soothing security blanket of weed takes away any motivation that you might have to change your circumstances. When you are using weed daily, often your perceptions of what is normal become different, and you will accept and stay in situations that you never would if you thought about them with a clear mind. Paranoia, invasive thoughts, and serious mental illness can also be caused by cannabis use. People with schizophrenia who smoke marijuana can have a serious increase in symptoms and ruin their lives. A very close friend of mine, almost like a sister, who had a great job in the financial industry, making over $250,000 a year, and she had a wonderful life, and started to use weed as an adult. It triggered her schizophrenia to a point where, like, this woman did not have schizophrenia. It basically planted the seeds for her to be a full-blown schizophrenic in the mental ward. So she was at a point where she ran around naked at work, beat up her family and friends, and eventually they had to call the cops on her, and she got sent to a psychiatric institution, and she'll be there for the foreseeable future. For people without schizophrenia and all those issues, just regular people, heavy use of weed can still cause serious mental issues. Scientists have done studies where small doses of THC, the active component of weed, reduce anxiety. Very small doses. But the higher doses that cause you to get high and catch a buzz can increase anxiety and bring on invasive thoughts and paranoia. I manifested many negative outcomes into my life because of weed use. Some examples I can give is worrying about getting a nail in my tire. And then because of constantly thinking about a nail going in my tire when I was high, it kept happening because I manifested it. Assumption hardens into fact. I also had many invasive thoughts that I was just not good enough to be with my girlfriend and she was just settling for me. And that made my attitude and mood terrible, which in turn was contagious to her. And that greatly damaged the relationship. I was using so much weed that I did not have the brain power to figure out what my true purpose in life was. And I worked many jobs that I was not passionate about and did not fit my skill set. I was in such a brain fog that I could not discover my own self-knowledge and put together the courage to try something new and out of my comfort zone. It was only after decades of stagnation and confusion that I was able to quit weed for good and find out what my true calling was. It makes me sad to think how many similar stories are out there. When my weed use was at its highest, I was trying to stop the invasive thoughts and anxiety that it caused. But the more weed I used, the more they came, and it had the opposite effect of what I was going for. And I was so miserable that one day I eventually just stopped. And I haven't used it since. With all the risks I just mentioned about weed, I do believe that it has some positive uses for certain people who have the self-control not to be addicted to it. I also believe in freedom and that adults should be able to choose whether or not they use weed and have the ability to buy it from a legal retailer as opposed to criminals who will oftentimes expose their customers to harder drugs. That being said, it is not a harmless natural substance that its proponents make it out to be. Everyone who decides to get involved with weed should set their limits for their use and stick to them, just like responsible drinkers do with alcohol. The proponents of weed say that alcohol is a much more harmful substance, and they are right. Many people die from alcohol all around the world, and a lot of murders are committed on it, and I'd say more murders than not and more domestic violence than not happens in alcohol. But we're not banning that because it's a part of the culture that's always been there. And I believe weed is the same way. We should have it legal, but we know the risks of getting involved in alcohol. And I'm just trying to get you to the risk of getting involved with weed. So weed is not harmless. The weed these days is exponentially stronger than what was available when I first started using it in the 2000s. One hit off a THC vape pen, which is oftentimes 80-90% of the active ingredient is THC in there, like 95%. So maybe when we were kids, we were smoking stuff that was, if we were lucky, 6 or 7% or less. So one hit off of one of those vapes is like smoking an entire joint in the 2000s. So your tolerance is going to go up way quicker, and you're going to get way more addicted and way more intoxicated using the high-grade marijuana they have these days. And a lot of the flower, the actual weed, is way stronger. So it's not the same drug that your parents smoked or you smoked when you were young. It's way stronger, way more addictive, and way more available. So it is a powerful drug, and you should know what you're getting into before you get involved with it. I just want to close off with, like, people like myself with addictive personalities. Weed can really become a serious addiction for us. And it seriously damaged my relationships, mental health, and achieving my purpose in life. And I know there's a lot of stories like mine, but I do not want to demonize it. There's a lot of uses for it as well, and there's people who can use it without getting hooked. So you should just know all the facts before you get involved. But it's not a wonder drug. It's not harmless, and it won't solve all your problems. If you're not putting a lot of brain power to living the life you want to live, and if you don't know what your purpose is, especially if you're young and you haven't figured out life yet, you need to stay the hell away from weed. And I know, like, it's really easy to want to say fuck it, especially during stressful times, but like I did when I took my first hit. But especially for young people whose brains are still growing, I do not think it's a good thing. So I'm going to close out with that. I love you guys. I care about you. Take care of yourselves. And, you know, respect yourself. Your brain is a wonderful thing. Your life is a wonderful thing. And you really need to be using it and not numbing it to live a full life. And I have coaching available, a free 30-minute session for new clients. So email me. My email will be below. So email me for a free 30-minute session to get started. And we can help you get unstuck and end the pain in your life. Take care, and I'll see you soon.